A young mother and her 6-month-old baby vanished from Everglades National Park, sparking a frantic search operation. When teams found nothing, investigators were left with the grim conclusion that they had been lost to the swamp's apex predators. The case remained frozen for a year, an official record with no final entry. That entry was finally written when hunters captured a python with a stomach so unnaturally swollen it defied belief. And the truth it contained was more horrific than any alligator attack. Music. Before we start, tell us where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's enjoy this gripping story. The asphalt parking lot near the entrance of Everglades National Park still radiated the stored heat of the day, even as the Florida sun dipped below the sawgrass horizon. It was Saturday, June 14, 2014. Era Connolly leaned against the hood of her car, the metal warm beneath her palms. The air, thick and humid, was alive with the rising chorus of cicadas and the distant guttural bellows of alligators beginning their nightly routines. She checked her phone again, 8:15 p.m. The screen illuminated her face, highlighting the deepening lines of concern around her eyes. Her daughter, 28-year-old Roisin Kalin, and her 6-month-old grandson, Tyran, were supposed to have met her here over an hour ago. The sprawling parking area, bustling with tourists, families, and airboat operators just hours earlier, was now almost desolate. A few park ranger vehicles were parked near the entrance station, but otherwise, Era was alone. She dialed Roisin's number for the 6th time in 30 minutes. It went straight to voicemail. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, distinct from the oppressive humidity clinging to her skin. Roisin was reliable. She was structured, meticulous in her planning, especially when it concerned Tyran. She wouldn't simply forget the pickup time or let her phone battery die without warning. Era scrolled through her photos, her thumb hovering over the image she had taken that very morning. It felt like a lifetime ago. Roisin had been so vibrant, standing next to the large gray boulder supporting the official Everglades National Park sign. She wore a bright yellow sundress patterned with green flowers, a wide-brimmed straw sun hat shielding her fair skin from the harsh sun. Dark sunglasses obscured her eyes, but her smile was wide and genuine. Strapped securely to her chest in a soft, grayish-blue fabric carrier was Tyran, beaming a wide, toothless grin at his grandmother. It was the picture of a perfect day out. Now, as the last vestiges of twilight faded and the encroaching darkness amplified the wild sounds of the swamp, the image felt haunting. Era pushed herself off the car and walked quickly toward the ranger station, the gravel crunching under her feet. Inside, the air conditioning was a sharp contrast to the heavy heat outside. She found a park ranger, Officer Davies, finalizing the day's logs. Era explained the situation, her voice trembling slightly as she relayed the details. Roisin, 28, Tyran, 6 months. They were supposed to be hiking the accessible trails, nothing strenuous. They had planned to spend the entire day, a much-needed escape from the pressures of Roisin's life. As the ranger began making calls, the context of Roisin's situation came into focus. She was a widow. Her husband had died unexpectedly less than a year prior, leaving her to navigate new motherhood alone and financially precarious. The life insurance payout had been meager, forcing her back into part-time nursing shifts sooner than she had anticipated. She was exhausted, juggling the demands of the hospital and the sleepless nights of an infant. But she was fiercely independent. She rarely accepted financial help from Era, determined to provide for Tyran herself. This trip to the Everglades was meant to be a reset, a breath of fresh air after a grueling week. Era had dropped them off at 10 a.m. Roisin had insisted on exploring alone. She wanted the quiet time with her son. They had packed enough supplies: water, snacks, diapers, a small first aid kit. Roisin respected the wilderness. She wasn't reckless. Officer Davies' demeanor shifted from polite concern to urgent professionalism. The Everglades was not merely a park, it was a vast, unforgiving wilderness spanning 1.5 million acres of wetlands. The dangers were numerous: dehydration, disorientation, alligators, venomous snakes. A lone woman with an infant was incredibly vulnerable. By 10 p.m., the entrance area was illuminated by the flashing lights of the local police department. An official missing person report was filed. As the oppressive darkness of the Florida night settled over the swamp, the search for Rasheen and Tyran Kalin began. The urgency was palpable. Every hour that passed decreased the chances of a positive outcome. The wilderness that had promised a day of peace now held the terrifying unknown. Dawn broke over the Everglades on Sunday morning. The rising sun cut through the thick, humid air, promising another day of brutal heat. The search operation mobilized overnight was massive in scale. The disappearance of a mother and infant triggered a multi-agency response that transformed the park entrance into a bustling, organized command center. Local police, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC, and National Park Service rangers coordinated their efforts. The air was thick with radio chatter, the roar of airboat engines, and the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades. The initial strategy was straightforward: focus on the areas Rasheen was most likely to have visited. Era Connolly, pale and sleepless, provided investigators with Rasheen's intended route. She had planned to stick to the well-maintained boardwalk trails near the main entrance. These were popular areas, heavily trafficked by tourists. It seemed impossible that someone could vanish from there without being seen, without leaving a trace. Airboats were deployed to scan the waterways in the vast fields of sawgrass, their massive fans roaring as they skimmed the surface of the shallow water. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging equipment flew low grids over the dense hammocks of trees, their sensors searching for any sign of human presence beneath the canopy. On the ground, teams of rangers, police officers, and experienced volunteers began walking the trails, calling Rasheen's name, their voices swallowed by the immense landscape. The K-9 units, brought in to track Rasheen's scent from the parking lot, struggled with the overwhelming sensory input of the swamp and the sheer number of people who had passed through the area over the weekend. While the physical search ramped up, detectives began the routine background investigation into Rasheen Kalin's life. They needed to understand who she was, and whether there was any underlying reason she might have chosen to disappear, or if someone might have had a motive to harm her. The picture that emerged was one of quiet resilience and heartbreaking normalcy. Rasheen was a dedicated mother, universally liked by her colleagues at the hospital. Her financial struggles were evident in her bank statements. The strain of managing on a single part-time income was clear. But she was managing. There were no signs of depression, no secret relationships, no significant debts to dangerous individuals, no enemies. She was simply a young widow trying to build a life for her son. The technical aspect of the investigation yielded little more than confirmation of the timeline. Rasheen's cell phone records were pulled. Her phone had last pinged a tower near the park entrance shortly after Era dropped her off on Saturday morning. After that, the digital trail vanished. It suggested the phone was either turned off, destroyed, or had moved out of range deep within the park very early in the day. The first 48 hours were critical, and the search teams pushed themselves to the limit. They found the detritus of tourism, stray water bottles, discarded wrappers, even a lost child's shoe, but nothing belonging to Rasheen or Tyran. The heat was relentless, the humidity oppressive. The searchers battled dehydration and exhaustion, driven by the urgency of finding the missing mother and baby. It was on the third day of the search, Tuesday, June 17th, that the operation encountered an unexpected and significant obstacle, one that would fundamentally alter the course of the immediate efforts. The command center was preparing to expand the search grid into the less popular, more rugged trails and service access roads that spiderwebbed deeper into the park. These were areas Rasheen was less likely to have gone, but with the primary trails yielding nothing, they had to be checked. It was the logical next step in a comprehensive search pattern. Detective Jasper Malleary, a seasoned officer serving as the local police liaison for the interagency coordination, arrived at the command briefing with urgent news. Malleary was known for his pragmatic, sometimes bureaucratic approach to police work. He addressed the search coordinators with a tone of serious concern. He informed them that a significant section of the planned expansion area, specifically several key access roads and the surrounding trails, was indefinitely closed, effective immediately. The reason, Malleary explained, was an environmental hazard. According to an incident report filed late Monday night, a private agricultural contractor working on adjacent land bordering the park had experienced a catastrophic equipment failure during a routine pesticide application. This failure resulted in the accidental overspray of a potent, restricted chemical into the park boundaries. The chemical, he detailed, citing the report, was dangerous if inhaled or touched before it degraded. The implications were immediate and devastating for the search effort. The contamination zone encompassed a large area directly adjacent to where Roisin might have wandered if she had become disoriented or sought a less crowded path. Due to the environmental hazard, ground teams and K-9 units were strictly forbidden from entering the zone. The risk of exposure to the searchers, Mullery emphasized, citing state and federal environmental regulations, was too great. The liability for the agencies involved was immense. The decision caused immediate frustration among the experienced park rangers and volunteer search leaders. They argued that they had specialized equipment to handle hazardous materials, that the risk was worth taking given the vulnerability of the missing infant, who had now been exposed to the elements for 3 days. They pleaded for a waiver, for a compromise that would allow them to search the area safely. But Detective Mullery was adamant. The regulations were clear. The zone was closed until environmental specialists could assess the risk and clear the area, a process that could take days, perhaps even a week. Furthermore, Mullery emphasized the inherent dangers of the deep swamp, the areas far beyond the contamination zone. He suggested that Roisin, perhaps seeking shade or becoming disoriented, had likely wandered much farther off the main paths than anyone initially believed. He pointed to the vast, inaccessible wilderness to the west, suggesting that was the most probable location given the lack of evidence in the accessible areas. The search was effectively diverted. Resources were poured into the deep swamp areas that required airboats and specialized equipment, areas where the chances of survival were slim. The air search continued over the contamination zone, but the dense canopy of cypress and mangrove trees made thermal imaging difficult and visual spotting nearly impossible. The most critical tool, meticulous ground searching, had been removed from a key area of interest. The days turned into a week. The media attention, initially intense, began to wane as the story stalled. The command center grew quieter. The army of volunteers dwindled. Despite the massive effort involving hundreds of personnel and thousands of man-hours, not a single trace of Roisin or Tyran had been found. No diaper bag, no shred of the yellow dress, no baby carrier. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the humid air. Era Connolly refused to accept the narrative that was forming. She knew Roisin. She would not have wandered recklessly into the deep swamp with her baby. The complete lack of any physical evidence felt wrong. It wasn't just that they hadn't found Roisin and Tyran, it was that they hadn't found anything. After 2 weeks, the active search was officially scaled back. The resources were needed elsewhere. The prevailing theory, the one documented in the reports and supported by the assessments presented during the briefings, was a tragic accident. Roisin and Tyran had succumbed to the elements or to wildlife deep within the Everglades. Their remains, investigators believed, were likely scattered by scavengers or submerged in the murky waters, lost forever to the swamp. Era protested, begging the authorities to keep looking, particularly in the areas they hadn't thoroughly searched on foot due to the contamination zone restrictions. But the investigation had hit a wall. The case files were organized, the reports finalized, and the disappearance of Roisin and Tyran Kalin began its slow descent into the archives of cold cases. A year passed. The silence from the Everglades remained absolute. The case of Roisin and Tyran Kalin had gone completely cold. The initial flurry of activity, the massive search, the media attention, it had all faded, leaving behind only the agonizing absence. For Era Connolly, the year had been a blur of grief and frustration. She never accepted the official conclusion that her daughter and grandson were simply lost to the swamp. She continued to press the authorities, hired private investigators, and distributed flyers, but every lead led to a dead end. The lack of any physical evidence remained the central, baffling mystery. The Everglades, meanwhile, continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human tragedy that had unfolded within its boundaries. But the ecosystem was under siege. An invasive species, the Burmese python, had established a destructive foothold, decimating local wildlife populations. In response, the state of Florida had authorized programs encouraging hobbyist hunters to track and remove these giant snakes, offering bounties and organizing hunts to curb the population explosion. It was June 2015. Wyatt Jones and Gareth Brody, two experienced python hunters, were deep in a remote grassy expanse of the Everglades, miles from the nearest road or tourist trail. They had been out since dawn, navigating the difficult terrain in their customized swamp buggy, scanning the dense vegetation for the distinctive pattern of python skin. The area was known for large snakes, and the conditions were perfect: hot, humid, the air still after a recent rain. The landscape stretched out before them, a vast field of tall, dry grass that took on a strange, almost pinkish-purple hue under the overcast sky. Late in the afternoon, as the light began to flatten, Gareth spotted it. Resting on a large, flat gray rock, partially obscured by the tall grass, was a massive Burmese python. It was easily one of the largest they had ever encountered, likely exceeding 16 feet in length. But it wasn't the length that immediately drew their attention. It was the girth. The snake was coiled, resting passively, its thick, muscular body covered in the distinctive interlocking patches of dark brown and black over a dull tan base. In the center of its body was a massive, elongated bulge. The shape was pronounced unnatural. The snake's skin was stretched tautly over the obstruction, clearly indicating it had recently consumed a very large meal. Wyatt slowed the buggy to a crawl, cutting the engine. The two men watched the snake for a moment, the silence broken only by the buzzing of insects. In the Everglades, a bulge that size usually meant one thing: a large deer, a hog, or perhaps a sizable alligator. It was a significant capture, both for the bounty program and for the removal of such a large predator from the ecosystem. They moved quickly, efficiently. Gareth raised his specialized shotgun, loaded with heavy shot designed for dispatching large reptiles. He fired a single shot, killing the snake instantly. They approached the carcass. The sheer scale of the snake was even more impressive up close. The bulge was immense, solid, stretching the snake's body to an unnatural dimension. They estimated the snake, with its meal, weighed well over 200 pounds. It took both men considerable effort, straining against the dead weight, to haul the massive carcass onto the back of the swamp buggy. They secured it with heavy straps and began the long, jarring ride back to civilization. Their destination was an official FWC check-in station where the snake would be measured, weighed, and documented as part of the python removal program. The sun was setting as they arrived at the station, a small outpost equipped for processing the hunters' catches. The FWC officer on duty, a young biologist named Ben Carter, was impressed by the size of the python. He helped them unload the carcass onto a large stainless steel necropsy table. The official measurements were taken: 16 feet, 4 inches, weight 218 pounds. As Officer Carter recorded the data, Wyatt and Gareth's curiosity got the better of them. It was standard practice to examine the stomach contents of the pythons. It provided valuable data on the snake's diet and its impact on the ecosystem. Given the size of the bulge, they were eager to see what it had consumed. They were convinced it was a mature white-tailed deer. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed, illuminating the scene. Wyatt took a large, sharp boning knife and prepared to make the incision. The atmosphere was casual, the men joking about the size of the antlers they might find. Wyatt pierced the taut skin of the snake's belly, making a long, clean cut along the length of the bulge. The hide was thick, requiring significant pressure to cut through. As the stomach cavity opened, the smell was immediate and overpowering, the distinct odor of advanced decomposition mixed with the musky, acidic scent of the snake's digestive fluids. It was stronger than usual, more pungent, but not entirely unexpected given the size of the meal. They peeled back the layers of skin and muscle tissue. The stomach lining was stretched thin, translucent in places. Wyatt made the final incision, opening the stomach itself. At first, the contents were difficult to discern, a compressed mass of partially digested tissue and bone. The digestive process of a python is powerful, breaking down even large animals relatively quickly. Gareth reached in, wearing heavy rubber gloves, attempting to identify the prey. He pulled at something large, heavy, lodged in the center of the mass. "Must be the hunch of the deer," Wyatt mumbled, leaning in closer. Gareth struggled with the weight, repositioning his grip. He pulled harder, and the object shifted, emerging from the grotesque mass. Then they saw it. It wasn't fur. It wasn't the hide of a deer. It was pale, smooth skin. Gareth recoiled, stumbling backward, his face draining of color. He gagged, the smell suddenly overwhelming. Wyatt froze, the knife still in his hand, staring at the contents of the snake's stomach. Exposed in the bright light of the check station was an entire human leg, severed at the hip. The toes were visible, the skin slick and discolored, but undeniably human. The realization hit them all simultaneously. This wasn't an animal. The python had consumed a human. The experienced hunters, accustomed to the grim realities of the wilderness, were profoundly shaken. The casual atmosphere of the check-in station shattered. Officer Carter, seeing the object, stepped closer to the table. He looked into the cavity, the horror registering instantly on his face. He immediately reached for his radio, his voice tight with urgency. "Dispatch, this is Everglades Station 7. We have a situation. We need homicide detectives and the me out here immediately. We've found human remains inside a python." The check station, usually a place of routine data collection, was immediately transformed into a crime scene. The area was cordoned off. Investigators arrived quickly, the gravity of the situation evident in their demeanor. The necropsy continued under the direction of the medical examiner. The process was meticulous, gruesome. Inside the python's digestive tract, they recovered not only the leg, but other significant body parts, a partial torso, an arm. The remains were severely degraded by the snake's powerful digestive enzymes, but they were unmistakably human, and they appeared to belong to an adult. The discovery was shocking, unprecedented, even in the Everglades, a place often associated with strange and macabre occurrences. The immediate questions were overwhelming. Who was this person? How did they end up inside a Burmese python? The initial theories were speculative. While a large python could potentially kill an adult human, it was extremely rare. It seemed far more likely that the snake had scavenged the remains. But the remains were dismembered. Pythons do not tear their prey apart. This suggested that something else had happened to the body before the snake found it. Investigators considered the possibility of a murder, the Everglades being a notorious dumping ground for bodies. The remains were carefully collected and transported to the medical examiner's office for analysis. The priority was identification. DNA testing was the only option. The DNA profile was extracted from the recovered bone marrow and entered into the National Missing Persons Database, CODIS. Days later, the match came back. The remains found inside the 16-foot Burmese python belonged to Roisin Kalin. The news hit Connolly like a physical blow. After a year of agonizing uncertainty, the fate of her daughter had been revealed in the most horrific way imaginable. The discovery confirmed Roisin's death, but it offered no closure. Instead, it ripped the case wide open, plunging the investigation into a new realm of terrifying possibilities. And it raised a critical, agonizing question. Where was Tai Ran? The discovery of Roisin Kalin's remains inside the Burmese python galvanized the investigation. The case, dormant for nearly a year, was immediately reopened and assigned to a specialized team of detectives from the Major Crimes Unit. The horrific nature of the discovery brought renewed media attention and immense pressure to find answers. But the confirmation of Roisin's death only deepened the central mystery. Critically, within the python, amidst the partially digested remains of the adult female, there were no remains, no clothing fragments, no trace whatsoever of 6-month-old Tai Ran. The investigation faced a complex puzzle, a gruesome equation with too many unknown variables. How did Roisin die? How was her body dismembered? And what happened to the baby? The first priority was to understand the interaction between the python and the remains. The medical examiner, Dr. Evelyn Reed, conducted a detailed analysis of the recovered body parts. The examination confirmed the initial assessment made at the scene. The python had scavenged the remains. It did not kill Roisin. There were no signs of constriction trauma, no crushed bones or widespread bruising consistent with a python attack. The dismemberment, the separation of the limbs from the torso, had occurred before the snake consumed the parts. This led to the prevailing hypothesis among investigators, the scavenger theory. They hypothesized that Roisin had died in the park a year prior, perhaps from exposure or an accident, as initially believed. Her body, they speculated, had been dismembered by the true apex predator of the Everglades, the alligator. Alligators are known to tear their prey apart using a violent death roll, often stashing the parts underwater to decompose before consumption. The python, an opportunistic feeder, must have found these scavenged parts and consumed them. This theory seemed plausible, fitting the brutal realities of the Everglades ecosystem. It explained the dismemberment and the python's involvement. It provided a narrative that aligned with the initial assumption that Roisin had died in the park. However, there were significant inconsistencies that troubled the lead detectives. The location where the python was found was analyzed. It was deep within the park, remote, but it was primarily a grassy expanse, not the deep water habitats typically favored by large alligators for stashing prey. Furthermore, the trauma at the points of dismemberment, while severely degraded by the python's powerful digestive fluids, did not seem entirely consistent with the typical tearing action of an alligator attack. The edges of the bone, where discernible, seemed cleaner, more precise than expected from a death roll. Despite these inconsistencies, the scavenger theory remained the leading hypothesis. The alternative, that a human had dismembered the body, seemed too horrific to contemplate without further evidence. The investigation focused on trying to locate the rest of Roisin's remains and any sign of Tyran. Search teams were redeployed to the area where the python was found, conducting meticulous grid searches, dredging nearby waterways, looking for any trace of the infant's clothing, the baby carrier, anything that might provide a clue as to what happened that day. The search yielded nothing. The swamp remained silent, offering no further clues. The mystery of Tyran's fate became the agonizing focus of the investigation. If Roisin had died in an accident, Tyran would have been with her. His remains should have been nearby. The absence of any trace suggested a terrifying alternative, that someone else was involved in their disappearance, and that Tyran had been separated from his mother. It was at this point that the investigation brought in a specialist. Dr. Aries Thorne, a forensic anthropologist renowned for his expertise in analyzing severely degraded remains and the anatomy of decomposition, was consulted to conduct a detailed examination of the recovered tissue. Dr. Thorne's task was to determine the timeline of events, the environment the body had been exposed to, and the nature of the dismemberment. The examination was conducted at the State Forensic Laboratory. The remains were carefully cleaned and prepared for analysis. Dr. Thorne spent days meticulously examining the tissue, the bone structure, and the cellular degradation. He analyzed the patterns of digestion, the effects of the python's enzymes on the remains, comparing them to known samples of decomposition in the Everglades environment. He noted that the state of the remains, while degraded by the python, seemed inconsistent with a year of exposure in the humid, biologically active environment of the swamp. The tissue preservation was better than expected. This observation further weakened the scavenger theory. It was during the microscopic examination of the muscle tissue that Dr. Thorne discovered the anomaly, a finding so unexpected that it would shatter the prevailing theories and alter the course of the investigation entirely. He was analyzing thin slices of the tissue under a high-powered microscope, examining the cellular structure. He noticed a specific pattern of damage that was completely out of place. The cell walls were ruptured in a distinct way inconsistent with normal decomposition, freezing temperatures in the wild, or the effects of the python's digestive fluids. He recognized the pattern immediately, though he had rarely seen it in a forensic context involving remains found in a subtropical environment. It was the signature of ice crystal formation artifacts. When biological tissue is frozen, particularly when frozen rapidly and kept at a consistently low temperature, the water inside the cells expands, forming sharp ice crystals that puncture the cell membranes. When the tissue is subsequently thawed, the structural integrity of the cells is compromised, leaving behind these distinct microscopic markers. Dr. Thorne conducted further tests, taking samples from multiple locations on the recovered remains. He confirmed his initial observation. The cellular damage was widespread, consistent throughout the tissue. The conclusion was unmistakable. Roisin Kalen's body had been frozen solid, likely in a commercial-grade freezer for an extended period, and subsequently thawed before being consumed by the python. The revelation was a forensic bombshell. It instantly invalidated the scavenger theory. Roisin had not died in the Everglades a year ago and decomposed naturally. The timeline of the investigation was completely wrong. The implications were staggering. Roisin Kaelin was murdered. Her body had been preserved, stored in a freezer for months, perhaps nearly the entire year since her disappearance. Then, relatively recently, likely just days before the python found her, her body was removed from the freezer, dismembered, and disposed of in the Everglades. The discovery explained the inconsistencies in the scavenger theory, the relatively good preservation of the tissue, the clean cuts on the bone. It all pointed to human intervention. The dismemberment was not the work of alligators. It was done by human hands, likely to facilitate the disposal of the body and increase the chances of it being consumed by scavengers. The python's involvement was not the central element of the crime. It was a random, bizarre accident that revealed it. The investigation shifted dramatically. This was not a tragic accident. It was a complex, calculated homicide. The level of sophistication required to store a body for a year suggested a perpetrator with resources, planning, and a chilling lack of empathy. The discovery also gave terrifying weight to the possibility that Tai Ran had been abducted. If Roisin was murdered, the perpetrator would have had to deal with the infant. The absence of Tyrans remained suggested he might still be alive, taken by the person or persons responsible for his mother's death. The investigation now faced a new set of urgent questions. Who had the motive and the resources to commit such a heinous crime? Where was the freezer used to store Roisin's body? And, most importantly, where was Tai Ran? The case, once thought to be a tragic mystery of the swamp, now revealed a darkness far more calculated and sinister than anyone had imagined. The hunt for a killer and a missing child began in earnest. The revelation that Roisin Kaelin's body had been frozen for nearly a year transformed the investigation from a localized mystery into a sprawling, complex homicide case. The immediate challenge was the time gap. The crime had occurred a year prior, but the evidence had only just surfaced. The trail was cold, deliberately frozen by a calculating killer. The investigation focused on the logistical requirements of the crime. Storing a human body for a year required a large freezer, likely a commercial-grade unit, significant energy consumption, and a secure private location where the body would not be discovered. Investigators began the arduous task of analyzing energy consumption records for the surrounding counties, looking for anomalies that might indicate the presence of a large, continuously running freezer. They cross-referenced this data with records of commercial-grade freezer purchases in the months leading up to and following Roisin's disappearance. They investigated hunting lodges, meat processing facilities, and isolated properties near the Everglades. The data pool was immense, the task daunting. The analysis yielded hundreds of potential leads. Each lead had to be investigated, a slow, meticulous process involving interviews, surveillance, and background checks. Weeks turned into months. Despite the intensive effort, the data yielded no immediate suspects. The perpetrator had successfully hidden their crime in plain sight, leaving no discernible trace of the storage location. The investigation stalled again. The initial shock of the python discovery and the forensic breakthrough faded, and the case began to drift back toward the cold case archives. The complexity of the crime and the lack of physical evidence from the original crime scene made progress nearly impossible. It was in 2016, nearly 2 years after Roisin's disappearance, that a fresh perspective was brought to the case. Detective Elena Ruiz, a meticulous investigator from the Cold Case Unit, began a comprehensive review of the entire case file. Ruiz was spurred by the evidence that the initial investigation in 2014 was flawed, perhaps critically so. The freezing evidence proved that the prevailing theory at the time, that Roisin died in the swamp, was wrong. Ruiz decided to re-examine the initial search effort from the ground up, looking for anomalies, missed opportunities, or anything that might explain how the crime scene, wherever it was, had been missed or overlooked. Ruiz spent weeks immersed in the 2014 files. She analyzed the search coordination logs, the deployment maps, the witness statements, the communication records from the command center. She focused on the decisions made during the critical first days of the search, the period when the trail was freshest. It was during this review that she encountered the contamination zone. The reports detailed the closure of a significant section of the park due to an accidental pesticide spill. The closure had diverted ground teams away from key areas near Roshin's last known location. At the time, it was treated as an unfortunate obstacle, a bureaucratic hurdle that hampered the search effort. But in light of the new evidence that Roshin was murdered and her body stored, the timing and location of the spill seemed suspiciously convenient. It had effectively shut down the search in a critical area during the most crucial window of the investigation. Ruiz decided to verify the incident report for the chemical spill. It was a routine check, a matter of due diligence. She started by contacting the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, requesting records of the reported pesticide overspray in June 2014. A spill of a restricted pesticide would generate a significant paper trail involving mandatory reporting and cleanup protocols. The EPA conducted a thorough search of their database. Their response was startling. There was no record of any such incident in the Everglades or the surrounding areas during that time period. Puzzled, Ruiz contacted the state agricultural agencies, the regulatory bodies responsible for pesticide use in Florida. They too found no record of a spill. She then attempted to contact the private agricultural contractor named in the police report as being responsible for the overspray. She discovered that the company did not exist. The conclusion was chilling and undeniable. The chemical spill was entirely fabricated. The contamination zone was a lie, a ghost story invented to obstruct the search for Roshin and Tyran. The implications were profound. It meant that someone with authority, someone inside the investigation, had intentionally sabotaged the search from the beginning. The focus immediately shifted to the officer who authorized the closure of the zone, Detective Jasper Mulleary. Mulleary, the police liaison during the initial search, was the one who reported the spill and enforced the closure. He had actively steered the investigation away from the restricted area, promoting the theory that Roshin had wandered deep into the swamp. He had been the architect of the misdirection. Detective Ruiz presented her findings to Internal Affairs. The realization that a police officer might be involved in the cover-up of a murder and kidnapping was explosive. Mulleary was immediately placed under investigation. A deep financial audit was initiated. Investigators began discreetly monitoring Mallory's activities, analyzing his communications, his movements, his behavior. They needed to understand the extent of the corruption, and more importantly, who Mulleary was working for. Mulleary, a veteran detective with years of experience reading the signs of an investigation, sensed the scrutiny, the sudden chill from his colleagues, the restricted access to case files, the feeling of being watched. He knew that the fabrication of the chemical spill was being uncovered. The realization triggered a desperate, panicked response. Late one night, long after the precinct had emptied, Mulleary made a critical mistake. He used his authorization code to access the department's archival server room. The room, located in the basement of headquarters, housed the physical servers containing the digital records of past investigations, including the detailed coordination logs and communications from the 2014 search. Mulleary believed he could physically destroy the servers, erasing the digital trail of his actions, the records of the fabricated spill, the communications authorizing the closure. If the data was gone, the evidence against him would be circumstantial. He entered the climate-controlled room, the air cold, the silence broken only by the whirring of the cooling fans and the hum of the servers. He located the specific server rack containing the 2014 data. He began the process of dismantling the hardware, attempting to forcibly remove the hard drives. The metal casing resisted his efforts. His hands slick with sweat, he pulled harder, the sound of wrenching metal echoing in the quiet room. He didn't know that Internal Affairs investigators, anticipating such a move, had placed the server room under surveillance. They were watching him on the security cameras, recording his desperate attempt to destroy evidence. As Mulleary struggled with the server rack, the hard drive finally coming loose in his hand, the door burst open. Internal Affairs investigators flooded the room, their weapons drawn, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the dim light. Detective Mulleary, step away from the server. Mulleary spun around, his face pale with shock and fear, the hard drive clattering to the floor. He was caught in the act, the dismantled server components scattered at his feet. The confrontation was tense but brief. Mullery, cornered and exposed, offered no resistance. He was arrested, suspended from duty, and the investigation escalated from an internal review to a criminal probe. The exposure of the fabricated chemical spill and Mallory's desperate attempt to destroy the evidence confirmed the existence of a conspiracy. The investigation now had a clear target. But the question remained, who was pulling the strings? Who had the power and the motive to corrupt a seasoned police detective and orchestrate such an elaborate cover-up? The arrest of Detective Jasper Mullery sent shockwaves through the department and the local community. The evidence of his corruption was undeniable, but the motivation remained the central question. Fabricating a chemical spill to obstruct a missing persons investigation, particularly one involving an infant, was an extreme measure. It suggested a powerful external influence, someone willing to pay a high price to keep the truth hidden. The investigation focused on the financial audit of Mallory's accounts. Internal affairs investigators, now working with forensic accountants from the state attorney's office, dug deep into Mallory's finances. The audit revealed a series of large cash deposits starting the day after Roisin Kalan disappeared in June 2014. The deposits were irregular, structured to avoid triggering mandatory reporting requirements, and completely inconsistent with Mallory's salary. The total amount exceeded $150,000 over the course of the 2 years since the disappearance. The cash deposits were difficult to trace, but the forensic accountants began the meticulous process of analyzing Mallory's financial activities, looking for connections, patterns, anything that might reveal the source of the money. They tracked the complex money laundering scheme Mullery had used to disguise the funds, channeling the cash through a series of intermediaries, small businesses, and shell accounts. It was a sophisticated operation, suggesting Mullery had assistance in hiding the money. After months of intensive forensic accounting, following the trail through a labyrinth of transactions, they finally traced the origin of the funds back to a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The corporation, named Osprey Holdings Group, had no visible business activities. Its sole purpose seemed to be obscuring the flow of money. The investigation then focused on identifying the individuals behind Osprey Holdings Group. The ownership structure was opaque, hidden behind layers of legal firewalls. But the investigators persisted, utilizing subpoenas and court orders to compel the disclosure of the corporate records. The trail led them to a name that resonated with power and influence in South Florida: Orion Vance. Orion Vance was a wealthy, politically connected real estate developer. He was known for his extensive land holdings bordering the Everglades, his lavish lifestyle, and his ruthless business practices. He was a major political donor, his influence extending deep into the local government. He was also known for his passion for alligator hunting, often organizing private hunts on his vast properties and within accessible areas of the Everglades. The connection between Orion Vance and the disappearance of Roisin Kalan was not immediately obvious. Vance moved in circles far removed from Roisin's life as a part-time nurse. But the financial link to Mullery was undeniable. The investigation now had a prime suspect, a powerful adversary with the resources and influence to orchestrate the cover-up. But they needed more than just a money trail. They needed evidence linking Vance directly to the crime. Investigators began a discreet probe into Orion Vance and his family, including his son, Cameron Vance, who was 18 at the time of Roisin's disappearance. They analyzed their movements in June 2014, their activities, their connections. But the Vances were insulated by their wealth and influence. Their properties were secure. Their activities, private. The investigation faced a formidable challenge. As the corruption investigation proceeded, focusing intensely on the Vance family, an unrelated breakthrough occurred thousands of miles away, a development that would unexpectedly converge with the Kalan case and break it wide open. It was early 2017. Interpol, in coordination with local authorities in Eastern Europe, conducted a series of raids on a high-end human trafficking ring operating out of Moldova. The ring specialized in illicit adoptions, procuring infants and young children for wealthy clients around the world. They provided a full service, from the acquisition of the child to the creation of fraudulent documents, to the transportation across international borders. The raids were the culmination of a long-term investigation into the activities of Gregor Yov, the elusive and ruthless head of the organization. During the raid on Yov's headquarters, a heavily fortified compound, authorities apprehended him and seized encrypted servers containing the organization's records, client lists, financial transactions, communication logs. The data was vast, complex, and protected by sophisticated encryption. Interpol's cybercrime unit began the painstaking process of decrypting and analyzing the seized data. It was during this analysis, deep within the encrypted files, that they discovered a record that immediately drew their attention. The record detailed the smuggling of an American infant from Florida in late June 2014. The infant, described as a male approximately 6 months old, matched the description of Tyran Kalin. The transaction was categorized as a priority extraction, commissioned by a high-paying anonymous client. The details of the transportation, the fraudulent documents, and the final destination were meticulously logged. The discovery was immediately flagged and relayed to U.S. authorities. The timing and location were too specific to be a coincidence. The possibility that Tyran Kalin had been trafficked overseas electrified the investigation in Florida. Detective Ruiz and her team compared the timing of the smuggling operation with the financial data from the Vance investigation. They focused on the Shell Corporation Osprey Holdings Group, controlled by Orion Vance. They discovered a massive wire transfer, totaling several $100,000, from Osprey Holdings Group to an offshore account linked to Gregor Yov's organization. The transfer occurred during the same week the baby was reportedly smuggled from Florida. The convergence of the two investigations was staggering. The connection between Roshin's murder, the corruption of Detective Maliri, and the international human trafficking ring solidified. The evidence painted a chilling picture. Orion Vance had orchestrated the cover-up of Roshin's death and the trafficking of her infant son. The realization that Tyran might still be alive, now 3 years old, living somewhere in Eastern Europe, injected a new, desperate urgency into the investigation. The focus shifted from simply proving the murder to rescuing the child. The investigation now had the evidence needed to confront the perpetrators. The time had come to dismantle the conspiracy and bring the truth to light. The evidence connecting Orion Vance to Roshin Kalin's murder and Tyran Kalin's abduction was overwhelming. The financial trail linking Vance to the corrupt detective Jasper Maliri and the international human trafficker Gregor Yov provided the leverage needed to dismantle the conspiracy. The investigation moved quickly. The priority now, the rescue of Tyran. The first target was Detective Maliri. He was already in custody, facing charges of obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and corruption. Now, armed with the irrefutable evidence of the bribery, the fabricated chemical spill, and the connection to the human trafficking ring, investigators confronted Maliri with the full weight of the case. They presented him with the Interpol data, the wire transfers, the undeniable proof that his actions had facilitated not just a cover-up, but the trafficking of a child. The interrogation was intense. Maliri, facing the prospect of federal charges related to human trafficking and potentially accessory to murder, realized the extent of his predicament. The years of deception, the weight of his complicity. Finally, it broke him. The prosecutors offered him a narrow window for cooperation. Maliri confessed. He admitted that Orion Vance had paid him to fabricate the chemical spill story. The purpose was to keep searchers away from a specific area of the Everglades, a remote access road near the Vance family's extensive landholdings, where the crime had occurred. Maliri claimed he didn't know the full details of the crime at the time, only that Vance needed the area secured and the investigation steered away from his family. He provided the details of their arrangement, the communication protocols, the payment schedule. He gave them everything they needed to move against the Vances. Mallory's confession provided the final piece of the puzzle, the direct testimony needed to secure search warrants for the Vance estate. The operation was planned meticulously. The Vance estate was sprawling, a heavily secured compound bordering the Everglades. The risk of confrontation or the destruction of evidence was high. The Vances were wealthy, armed, and desperate. A coordinated, high-stakes SWAT operation was authorized. The target, the arrest of Orion Vance and his son, Cameron Vance, now 21 years old. The operation involved federal agents, state police, and the local SWAT team. At dawn, the operation commenced. A convoy of armored vehicles, supported by helicopters overhead, descended on the Vance estate. They breached the gates and secured the perimeter, moving rapidly toward the main villa. The silence of the early morning was shattered by the roar of the engines, the chopping of the helicopter blades, and the shouts of the SWAT team. The team assigned to the main villa moved quickly, breaching the entrance with a controlled explosion and fanning out through the opulent rooms. The interior was vast, a maze of corridors and luxurious furnishings. They found Orion Vance in his study, seemingly preparing for his day, oblivious to the impending raid. He was arrested without incident, his demeanor cold, arrogant, and defiant, even as the handcuffs were secured around his wrists. Simultaneously, another team moved to secure Cameron Vance. He was in the guest house, a smaller residence located several hundred yards from the main villa. But as the police vehicles approached, Cameron heard the commotion. He looked out the window, saw the flashing lights and the armored vehicles converging on the estate. Panic seized him. Cameron bolted from the guest house, jumping into a high-powered off-road vehicle parked nearby. He gunned the engine and tore across the expansive property, heading toward the dense wilderness of the Everglades bordering the estate. He knew the terrain intimately, having hunted there since childhood. The chase was immediate and tense. The SWAT team pursued Cameron in their vehicles, the off-road terrain making the chase difficult and dangerous. Cameron drove recklessly, weaving through the trees, attempting to reach the inaccessible areas of the swamp where he believed he could escape. The helicopter monitoring the operation tracked his movements. The thermal imaging camera locked on the heat signature of the vehicle, relaying his position to the pursuing ground teams. The chase spanned several miles of the Vance property, a high-speed pursuit through the rugged landscape. Cameron pushed the vehicle to its limits, but the coordinated effort of the ground teams and the air support was too much. They managed to corner him, cutting off his escape route near a deep canal. Cameron, realizing he was trapped, abandoned the vehicle and attempted to flee on foot, scrambling into the dense undergrowth. He was apprehended after a brief struggle, his face pale with fear, the realization of his situation finally sinking in. With both Orion and Cameron Vance in custody, the investigation focused on the search of the estate. The priority was to locate evidence of the murder, specifically the freezer used to store Roisin Kalen's body. The estate was vast, with multiple buildings, storage facilities, and hunting lodges. The search was meticulous and systematic. Crime scene investigators, armed with the knowledge of the freezing evidence, focused on areas capable of housing a large freezer. It was in the basement of the main villa that they found it. Concealed behind a false wall in a large storage area was a commercial-grade walk-in freezer, the kind used in restaurants or for storing large quantities of game meat. It was running, the temperature inside well below freezing. The freezer was empty, recently cleaned, the surfaces scrubbed spotless, the air inside smelling faintly of bleach. But the forensic teams knew that cleaning a freezer used to store a human body for a year would not erase all traces of evidence. They began the meticulous process of forensic analysis. They used luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, causing it to glow blue in the dark. They sprayed the interior of the freezer. The surfaces glowed faintly, indicating the presence of blood that had been cleaned. The critical evidence came from hidden areas, places where cleaning would be difficult, microscopic crevices where biological material could accumulate. Investigators focused on the rubber seals around the freezer door and the intricate grooves where fluids could seep and become trapped. They dismantled the drainage system, the pipes where condensation and fluids would collect. The forensic teams collected samples, conducting preliminary tests on site. The results were positive. They found trace evidence of Roisin Kalen's blood and DNA preserved within the seals and the drainage system of the freezer. The discovery was the final, irrefutable proof. The freezer confirmed where Roisin's body had been stored for a year, linking the Vances directly to the murder and the elaborate cover-up. The chain of evidence was complete. Orion and Cameron Vance were interrogated separately at the Federal Detention Center. The weight of the evidence against them, the financial records linking them to Mallory and YJO, Mallory's confession, and the DNA evidence recovered from the freezer was insurmountable. Under the intense pressure of interrogation, Cameron Vance broke down. The fear and guilt he had suppressed for nearly 3 years finally surfaced. He confessed to his role in the crime, the details spilling out in a torrent of panicked words. Cameron admitted that on June 14, 2014, he was driving his truck on a service access road in the Everglades. He was 18 years old, intoxicated, and illegally hunting alligators. He was driving recklessly, speeding down the narrow road when he rounded a bend and struck Roisin Kalin. The impact was sudden and brutal. Roisin was thrown to the ground, knocked unconscious, bleeding profusely from a head wound. Cameron stopped the truck, panicking. He saw Roisin lying on the road, the baby strapped to her chest. Miraculously, Roisin had shielded Ty Rand during the fall. The infant was unharmed, crying but alive. Cameron, drunk and terrified of the consequences, a potential DUI manslaughter charge that would destroy his future, called his father. Orion Vance arrived at the scene quickly. He assessed the situation with cold calculation. He saw his son intoxicated, the injured woman, and the crying baby. In a ruthless decision to protect his son and his family's reputation, Orion took control. Instead of calling for help, Orion loaded the unconscious Roisin and the crying Ty Rand into his truck. He drove them back to the estate. There, in the secluded basement of the main villa, Orion murdered the injured Roisin, ensuring her silence. He then placed her body in the commercial-grade walk-in freezer, preserving it while he orchestrated the cover-up. He immediately contacted Detective Mulleary, utilizing his influence and promising a substantial payment to fabricate a chemical spill, keeping the search away from the accident site. The baby Ty Rand presented a different problem. Orion couldn't kill the infant, but he couldn't keep him either. He used his connections in the criminal underworld to contact Gregor Yusuf's organization. He arranged for Ty Rand to be handed over to the human trafficking ring a few weeks later, paying a substantial fee for the illicit adoption and the guarantee that the child would disappear without a trace. Roisin's body remained in the freezer for a year. When the case went cold and public attention faded, Orion decided to dispose of the body. He removed it from the freezer, dismembered it to facilitate disposal, and dumped the parts deep in the Everglades, hoping the scavengers would erase the evidence of his crime. He never anticipated that a Burmese python would consume the remains and reveal the truth. The confessions were detailed and chilling. The crime was not premeditated murder, but a series of calculated, ruthless decisions driven by a desperate attempt to protect wealth and privilege. With the confession secured and the evidence compiled, the focus shifted to the rescue of Ty Rand Kalin. Utilizing the information from the seized servers and the Vance's confessions, Interpol tracked the smuggling route. They identified the adoptive family in Eastern Europe. The family, unaware of the horrific circumstances of the adoption, had been deceived by Yusuf's organization. The process was delicate and complex, involving international diplomacy and legal negotiations. Finally, after weeks of coordination, authorities located Ty Rand, now 3 years old. He was healthy, safe, and unaware of his tragic past. Connolly immediately traveled to Eastern Europe. The journey was a blur of anxiety and hope. After nearly 3 years of agonizing grief, she was finally going to see her grandson. The reunion took place at a government facility. Era waited in a quiet room, her heart pounding. The door opened, and a social worker walked in, holding the hand of a small boy. The moment Era saw Ty Rand, the resemblance to Roisin was unmistakable. The years of grief, the weight of the loss, finally lifted. She knelt down, tears streaming down her face, and opened her arms. Orion and Cameron Vance were charged with murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, and obstruction of justice. They both received lengthy prison sentences, their wealth and influence unable to shield them from the consequences of their crimes. Jasper Mulleary was convicted for his role in the conspiracy and imprisoned. Era Connolly gained full custody of Ty Rand, returning to Florida to begin a new life, honoring Roisin's memory by providing Ty Rand with the love and security his mother had fought so hard to give him.